Welcome everybody to today's episode of the Conscious Grief series. I am delighted to be here with Anniki Sommerville, writer and broadcaster. So thank you very much for joining me today.
Oh, I'm really glad to be here. And yeah, I'm really looking forward to catching up.
Yeah, and I have to say that thank you very much to Lisa Williams for connecting with me.
Yeah, I love Lisa. She's obviously, we worked together on the hotbed, and yeah, it's quite sad. We haven't seen one another. We're trying to sort of work out some sort of way of seeing one another because it's like everybody, we've all been locked away.
Locked away, exactly. Now we're re-emerging back
Yeah,
to our lives. Yeah. And Lisa said, you would be a great person to talk to you because you've spoken outwardly about the grief in your own life, and we're going to also talk about your book and podcast, How to Be a Boss at Aging, and the grief that comes with that, which I think is so fascinating because we don't normally associate grief with the things that happen with aging, but we'll get to that. And firstly, I like to ask people, about your own definition of grief, because it can be quite personal to each person. So would you give us your definition?
Well, I think it's something I'm still struggling to sort of define. And one of the things I noticed is that I lost my half sister and my stepmom when I was about 14, and the grief then was very, very different to the grief that I've had more recently with losing my father last year. And I don't know. I think at the moment I would say that grief for me is just kind of a continual sense of loss, really. So kind of, and there's moments in the day when I might forget about that and sort of be able to resume sort of normal life. And one of the things I've noticed is that as the time sort of goes past, those moments when I can almost forget that it's happened become more prevalent. So that's happening more often. Whereas in the first few months, it was the only thing really that I felt that I was processing. I was kind of constantly in this state of loss. But I sort of define it as just really, really missing somebody that you've loved. And I think the thing that a lot of people struggle with is it's kind of an unfinished relationship, because it's a relationship which suddenly becomes one where it's one-sided. So you still have the relationship with the person, you still love them, but they can no longer sort of reply to you or connect to you, and that is a constant source of just being sad, really. Because the problem is, I think for me, certainly with missing my dad, is that there's so many occasions now where I think, oh, I'm just going to give my dad a ring, oh, I'm just going to text him, and because it's still fairly early in the process, I don't think initially you even absorb the fact that they're not there anymore. So it's really, it's one of the most difficult things. What it is, I think, the most difficult thing you can go through.
Yeah, it truly is. And I have spoken to a Chinese medicine practitioner while doing this, and she was saying how the Taoists say grief is the hardest emotion,
Yeah,
for us. And, in a way, that's what makes it so fascinating. And in a sense, we haven't been able to, sometimes we just don't know what to do with it because everybody deals with it very unique, in a very unique way. And it's not something that sometimes people want to talk about. It's something that people want to keep quite personal, but I really see that changing. And you obviously have your podcast and your Instagram page, and I was interested, do you feel like that's quite a helpful part of your grieving process to talk about it openly?
yeah. I mean, it's funny because have been I've always been someone who shared a lot anyway. And before I even got onto social media, I was the kind of person that if you'd met me in a work context, I probably would have immediately said something quite revealing and then worried afterwards that I'd been too revealing and kind of dissected it. Thought, oh God, why have I said that? So for me, it was natural that, whenever I've gone through positive things or really negative things, I've tended to share them. One of the things I found helpful was that there was a lot of people who then messaged me who'd lost parents too. And that I found some sort of sense of just bonding, because the thing is, my dad died just at the beginning of lockdown, so there wasn't really anyone to, apart from my immediate family, like, you know, my partner and my young kids, there wasn't really anyone that I could connect with. So at that point in time, just having other people saying, listen, I'm here for you if you do want to talk, you know, whatever. And it's normal to feel completely crap, and, you know, just be kind to yourself, some of those things, I think that really really helped. We don't talk about it enough, I don't think. And, you know, it was very peculiar, like when my dad sort of went, he died on his own in hospital, because unfortunately, because of the restrictions, he went in, he had an aneurysm, so he just collapsed at home. He went into an ambulance on his own, and then he went into surgery on his own. And really knew, I think, when he was having the surgery, that he was potentially not likely to survive it. And from some cruel twist, I called up the hospital and they said, oh, I think your dad has just come out of surgery, and you know, he's sitting in the recovery area. And so I actually went to bed, and thought, well, this is fine. And then at 10 o'clock, unfortunately, my stepmom called, and she said, he's died. And so for me, and I think for many people who've lost people suddenly, or lost people in this strange COVID experience, the death seems even more abstract, because you weren't there to see it. You weren't there to kind of be with your loved one, and you're not seeing anybody else. So it's really strange. So kind of like the time when it's kind of hit me again has been like, for example, today my mum's popped over and she's in the garden, and it's now starting to hit home more, because obviously when you're not seeing anyone, I didn't think it was unusual not to see him. So I think I do really feel for people who have, I mean, anyone who's lost anyone at any point, but I think the dynamics of it are slightly different depending on the circumstances. And I think what I've struggled with is the acceptance of it, because I didn't see any of it happening. So there's many times where what I'm doing is just regurgitating in my head what happened, how did it happen, how could it have not happened, you know, and that goes round and round in quite an unhelpful circle. But I think when you read about grief, that is quite normal. There's kind of people, the first step is people sort of going, how could I have stopped this? And then maybe some guilt around, I should have done something to stop this. And I've read about the different stages of grief, and I think what I've noticed is that it's not linear. So on one day I can accept it, but then the next day maybe not accept it. So it would be lovely to say that, you know, like if you're training for a run, you would say, I just run it a bit further every day. I think with grief, it's not like that. You know, you could have a good day, and then you suddenly have a really shit day, and then you have a good day. And it's a very wiggledy line.
Definitely. It's a wiggledy line or a scribbly line. It's really, all over the place. And I really can, I think, like you're saying, empathize with these situations during COVID, because something that really kind of helps our grief is to be with that person when they die, so that we can say certain good things, or we can really, like you're saying, sort of accept that they're not here anymore. And another person that I've interviewed for this series, she is a death midwife. She really encourages people to have the body of somebody in the house for up to 3 days, because that really helps us in our process. So, you know, losing your dad during COVID and not seeing him, and that is a really difficult process.
Sure. And I think, I mean, we were sort of talking earlier about how, you know, before we started recording, about how grief has changed. And so when I sort of think about, you know, the late 80s, when I lost my stepmom and half sister, that was completely hidden away. So that those deaths were, we didn't have any photos in the house of them. I wasn't encouraged. I was only quite young, so I wasn't encouraged to go and see them in the funeral home. And in fact, their ashes were taken away to another place. So the whole thing almost just felt, sometimes I see this almost, you know, when people just go up in a puff of smoke, you know, they're suddenly there and then they're not there. And I think our brains really struggle to comprehend that. And in Western culture, we haven't really got a process in place that helps us slowly acclimatize, because it's just, we're so divorced from the whole process. It's like they get sent off to somewhere else, they get cremated, they come back in a little box. It's very clinical. When my stepmom received my dad's ashes, they came in this really lovely bag, but it was a bag that you might buy a really nice pair of shoes in. It was kind of like a shiny green, mint green bag. And I just thought, this is so weird. And my dad is sat in that bag in this very lovely sort of polished box. And I think that's the notion that you could have a body in the house, or that you could have some sense of just being faced to, I mean, it's a very upsetting thing, but being able to face up to that, rather than almost, I think we've moved to this thing where, okay, if we don't think about it and we just push it away, maybe it's not actually happening. And that has all sorts of repercussions, because you've got to process it, essentially, haven't you? And I see other cultures where people are wailing and shouting and screaming and crying, and I'm thinking that looks quite healthy to me.
Yeah, definitely. We have become very detached from the process. We sort of handed over our control, if you like, to the funeral homes, and we say, oh, that's what you do, rather than, well, maybe I would like to do it differently. And I think we're seeing this emergence of new ways of dealing and coping. And I was curious, with your dad's funeral, were you able to have a funeral?
Well, we had a funeral, but it was quite surreal, in that there was a limit on how many people could be there. And in fact, my partner and I travelled to Essex, where he lived, and his partner was there, my stepsister was there. But initially we were kind of saying, we're not actually allowed to embrace one another. And we weren't, in theory, allowed to go into the house. Though I did, the minute that we drove up, I did go into the house, because to me, it felt completely alien. My dad had a study that was downstairs, and I had to go into that study. For me, I had to go there just to recognize that he wasn't around and to see his things. So it's almost like I knew that the protocol was to not do that. And equally, we did say, I said, look, I am going to hug you. And my stepmom was like, yes, no, we do have to do that, because I think in order to, there's been all sorts of horrible situations where people have been, unable to stand close to family members, and we did all have to be distanced from one another. But it was very peculiar. It is very peculiar, and I think that again just added to this sense that it hadn't really happened, because we didn't feel that we could perhaps have the kind of ceremony that we would have had ordinarily, where we would have had lots of people coming together. And the sad thing is that now that the time's passed, it's been just over a year, we're still not in a position, I think, where we can do that. And so my dad would have actually loved it, though, because he was he was a Marxist, and he was he was also an atheist. And so he would have always said, I want to have a really simple, functional, he didn't have any romantic idea of the funeral that he wanted. So I think he would have loved it, because he would have been like, this is great, because it's just a very small selection of people and there's no fuss. But I would have liked a bit more fuss.
Yeah, well, I like that you can kind of see that it's something that would have suited him. That gives a little sense of peace. But yeah, I agree with this, taking some form of control in that situation back into your own hands and hugging, because my God, it's just so terrible not to be able to hug one another at a time like that.
Exactly, especially when it's the first time you've seen, so you've just learned that the person's died, and then it's very unnatural then, to the first time that you see them, to not be able to hug them. I think once we made that decision, it felt it was quite a relief, really, because it was like, okay, we still had all our masks on and everything, but yeah, it was very weird.
Yeah, and I can see definitely how coming now, starting to come out of the lockdown, starting to see other friends and family, I mean, of course, this process of grief is going to reemerge continuously, but again, it's like communicating with people that you haven't seen for a long time, and it brings it back up. It brings it back up to the surface.
Yeah, I mean, we used to have, my family's quite large, and it's because my parents separated, and so they went on to have children with other partners, and so we used to often meet here, and we'd all be in the garden, and it would be quite chaotic. And I think I'm kind of dreading having the first one of those. We've not been able to do it yet, but kind of I really will sense then. I mean, my dad was very quiet, so he'd usually be sitting in the corner, but I think just the sense that he's not going to be there I'll only be able to feel that when we do our first one of those.
Yeah.
It's funny you said about different rituals, because one of the things that I found useful is I've kind of started developing my own little things to almost make him feel like he's still here. So I've got a shed, and in the shed I've got a plastic sort of box with some of his belongings in. And yesterday there's an old sweatshirt in there. He used to love motorcycling, and he stopped in the more recent years, but he had this black sweatshirt with a motorcycle on the front. And I just put it, I didn't want to wash it. And then yesterday I washed it, and I took it out from the shed, and I was like, okay, I'm going to start wearing this sometimes. I'm going to start, I feel like I'm sort of at the point where I can start wearing some of these things. And I have a jumper of his as well in the cupboard, and that I've decided not to wash because that still smells of him. So I pick that out, and I'm getting slightly panicked because it's losing some of the smell. So I kind of, but I do it every night. I put my head in it, just have a really good smell. And it's quite revolting because sometimes I try and literally get my nose right into the armpit because I'm kind of like, I really want to try and get as much smell as possible. And it's very comforting. And I think I was talking to someone else, and I think you have to sort of do the things that make you feel better. I've also realized that there's lots of things that don't make me feel better. Like I've got texts and voicemails from him. I find that often, certainly listening to his voice doesn't work. It's not a good thing for me to do. And sometimes I'm not feeling robust enough to go through the text. There's so many texts in there. So you kind of start to find your way about what works and what doesn't work. But I think that's an interesting thing as well, is that people now have this huge digital thing that lives on afterwards. So my dad loved texting, and he probably sent me about 3 or 4 texts a week, and all of them were very long, and usually he very well punctuated. He'd put commas, and he'd put full stops, and I've kept all of those, but then there's also part of me that, again, I have to look at them when I'm feeling strong enough. And I think it's also just recognizing, before you do something, how is this going to make me feel? So if I'm feeling really shit today, and then I think initially I would literally just launch into the texts, and I'd feel absolutely dreadful. Whereas now I'll go, okay, maybe don't do that now, because you know how it's going to make you feel. Whereas there might be another day where I'll think, oh, I remember he sent me a really funny one. I'm going to see if I can find that one. And actually that might make me feel a bit better. And I think that's the only advice I've got for people who are grieving, is that as you get further along, have a little think about, where you are, how your day is, and whether you feel strong enough, or, because you can sometimes just amplify it to a point that's not helpful.
Yeah, for sure. And I would say, have you archived the text messages, like saved them somewhere?
Well, I think they're on my laptop, because I had a really terrible thing where I accidentally deleted, his phone doesn't obviously exist anymore. So I was still sending him texts even after he died. I continued doing that. I think that's quite common. And then suddenly managed to delete them off my phone, but they're still on the laptop. And I haven't quite worked out how to do that, but I think they're hopefully sitting on the cloud, I think.
Yeah, because even if you took screenshots or something like that, just then you have them to look at later. You never know.
Yeah.
What happens to our technology, but if you can try and save it, because I have to say, one of the things that I am so grateful for, I realized, like my mother and my mother's mother, I have a lot of letters that they wrote, And I just love reading those. And they're from like the 1960s and pre then. And so that for me is so precious because I feel really close to them. And I understand right now, it's still so early stages for you. But and everything's so digital now. So we kind of need to find new ways of keeping things safe and organized in that sense, so that you may come back to them in 5-10 years time, and when you have the time and the space.
And it's quite weird because the other thing is that I hadn't realized with a lot of photos now, because they're live, if you hold your finger down on them, they turn into video. And so a lot of the images I've got of my dad, I keep kind of obsessively keep pressing them to hear his voice then, because there's often him talking at the same time. And I think initially in the first couple of months, I was really wallowing in all of that stuff. Like I would really just sit and, really cry and look through it. And then, yeah, I think the only thing that's happened is I've just become a bit more mindful, because I'm kind of like, hang on a minute, I'm tired. I've got, I'm feeling overstretched. I can't go there today,
Yeah, and that's so wise, because we only have the capacity for so much, don't we? And you, like we were saying before we started the interview, you're a mum of 2 young girls, and creating a lot of things all the time. So
yeah, I think that's it. And you're kind of like, it's not always useful, kind of like, oh God, you can sometimes sabotage yourself. You're kind of like, hang on a minute. In the old days, I think I was talking to Carrie Lloyd, who's got a podcast, Griefcast, and she was saying in the old days you would have had a box of photos, shoebox maybe, and they would have maybe been up in a cupboard, and you would have made a decision to get them down from the cupboard and look through them. Whereas because our phones are so accessible, you can be just browsing for a top on Zara, and then you hit a photo, and actually you're not doing that in a mindful way. You're not kind of going, right, I'm going to go and get those photos now, and I'm going to spend half an hour just having a really lovely look through. You're just suddenly, without really thinking about the consequences, dipping into something that's very sad.
Absolutely. And these memories as well, which is gorgeous. As amazing as it is that the iPhone creates these, oh, remember what you were doing this time last year. Again, it's not a choice.
Yeah.
It just comes up, and then it brings up all the emotions again.
Yeah, exactly.
It's really, really good point. Really good point. I want to change the direction a little bit. But thank you so much for sharing everything that you've shared about your dad. And I wish we had more time, because there's so much we could talk about.
Oh, I know.
I really wanted to talk about your book and your podcast, How to Be a Boss at Aging, because I think this is like such a fascinating topic, and there's so much grief that can happen as we age. So could you, I don't know, you probably have things that you want to share on that. I was particularly interested in the menopause piece, but go wherever you like with it.
Well, the book I started writing it just after I lost my dad. So it kind of, I started doing a podcast from home, and essentially was kind of suddenly realized, I think with the loss of a parent, because I'm in my late 40s now, and I kind of was like, oh, I'm almost like the next in line, because you lose a parent and then you sort of think, okay, we've all moved up a rung now, because we're, and it's quite a significant thing. So I think what the book does is each chapter takes a different subject. So there's kind of one on infertility, there's on relationships, on work, on menopause, on anxiety. And I think what had happened is that after you lose someone, you just suddenly reassess your own life. And I was kind of like, oh my God, what does my life mean? Where am I going? What does life as an older woman look like? How come at the moment I feel like I've got so many questions and not any answers? And so then I started interviewing people who I thought might have some of the answers, and different experts, and sort of saying, listen, what do we do about this? And it was a really helpful process for me, because it gave me something else to focus on. I was on furlough, so I wasn't having to work at that point. And I just sort of treated it as like, what am I interested in uncovering? Oh, this is a subject I'm really interested in. Let's talk about it. The whole thing around grief, I think, was that I felt when you get older, you kind of, the grief can unearth a lot of trauma that you've kind of buried. So for me, I think you get to a point in your life when you spend quite a lot of time looking backwards and you sort of think about, you know, your childhood, your teenage years. Should I have done things differently? Am I happy with where I've landed now? And maybe I feel like we live a lot of our life on fast forward, and we're kind of running and running and running. And then you get to your 40s and you're like, shit, actually, do I like where I am, or do I need to change direction? And you don't slow down. I mean, that's the thing. You still continue running, but you're just still thinking a bit about, am I happy, essentially, and how can I be happier? And I think for me, my dad dying unearthed a lot of trauma that I'd buried in my teenage years and hadn't really processed. And so I started to suffer with anxiety, and I started to get a lot of symptoms. And the confusing thing is that when you get to sort of my age, the symptoms can be attributed to past trauma, but they could also be hormonal things that you're going through, perimenopause. I think there's almost like a lot of processing that goes on. And so that's kind of why I was interested in exploring aging, because I was kind of like, I feel like there's quite a lot of role models for when we're in our 70s and 80s. You know, we look at people like Jane Fonda or Judi Dench and we go, oh God, they're amazing, aren't they? But for women who are in, you can only really call it middle age, you know, midlife, where you're not at the beginning, you're not at the end, but you're somewhere halfway through, maybe just beyond halfway. That's a time where there's just so much stuff being flung in your direction. So I was just in, I think the grief set off that process of me wanting to know more about, you know, I'm not going to die hopefully soon, but when you've lost somebody, the reality of death comes home, and you're kind of like, okay, if I did die tomorrow, would I be happy with kind of my life as it sits now? And if I'm not, what can I do to change that?
Yeah, I love that, because I very much live by that myself. And I think I've always sort of lived by that, but from having lost my dad at a young age. You know, he was 42, so sometimes I use that age thinking, oh my God, if now I've got 2 more years to live, what am I doing, what I really want to be doing, and check in with myself about that. I was really interested about, you were talking about the anxiety that you had as a teenager. And you said you lost your mum, your stepmom, and your stepsister at that time. So is the anxiety related to that trauma?
I mean, I think some of it was basically my stepmom, unfortunately, she had like a postnatal psychosis. And so she committed suicide, and she jumped off a building with my half sister, who was only 6 months old at the time, and they both died. So under really horrific circumstances. And I think that inadvertently, I didn't have any counselling, I didn't have any therapy. And the day after it happened, my mum and I, because my mum and dad had separated, we went to the house and we were tasked to clear the house out. So we just went along, and I was 14, and basically picked up all of the baby things, put them into bags, picked up anything, you know. I mean, it was only in retrospect that I think now, I think, God, that was such a horrible experience. And everything was sort of put away and not really discussed. And I think one of the things I ended up doing was that I threw myself into work. You know, ultimately, I went off on a tangent. I sort of ran away, had a lot of hedonism, then came back, then dedicated myself to my career, and really didn't question. I just kind of almost thought, if I get a steady job and if I just play by the rules, if I don't take any risks, nothing bad is going to happen to me. So I'm going to, you know, I was never very rebellious. You know, I think I was just a people pleaser, and I was kind of obsessed with the idea that I wanted to, you know, have my own house. I wanted to have a very safe environment. I wanted to have a family. But it's only now that I sort of think about it and I think, oh, you know, I've always been creative, but I sat on that. I kind of was like, I can't do that because it's not going to make enough money. It's not going to create the kind of secure environment that I felt I needed. And so there's been positives and negatives, because it made me very driven in my work, and it made me achieve a certain level of success. But then I got to the very top of a company. I was a managing partner in a company, and I sort of was suddenly like, I bloody hate this. This is awful. What am I doing? You know, I've spent 18 years working like a demon to achieve something that means nothing to me. Um, and I think that's quite common with grief, is that you kind of almost get on a treadmill of kind of busyness and doing and doing and doing, and then you get off and you think, you know,
Yeah,
what was that all about?
totally. It makes complete sense. You know, that was like such a huge trauma. And as you were saying, that was in the 80s, and then you just, everybody's like, take the photos down and like, let's sort of, you know, be strong, keep going, carry on, and forget about it. And yeah,
Yeah,
that is really an extraordinary thing to have gone through at the age of 14, which of course has shaped all of the things that you talked about, you know, wanting to create a safe environment, and then this recent passing of your dad,
mm.
bringing all of that back up to the surface. So
And that's, I think that's the sad thing, is that because we were we were a family unit, you know, and so I guess, you know, I was very close to my stepmom, and very, you know, very much, she was very important to me in those growing up years of sort of, you know, being a feminist. And we used to get up in the morning and do yoga together. And the problem is now is that, you know, she always had the ingredients for motherhood to be a disaster for her, because she was a real perfectionist and she wanted to get everything right. And she was very dedicated to sort of the right diet, the right food. She wanted everything to be just so. And it was only when I became a mother that I was like, actually, that's, you can't do that. Like, suddenly, what your expectations are in terms of it's going to be perfect, I'm going to manage it all, I'm going to control it all. You can't do it, because it's you know, they're unpredictable and difficult, and you're faced with challenges all the time. So I think what makes me sad now is, I think if it was today, I think she would have received the support she needed. I think back then, I think there was no real understanding of postnatal mental health, you know.
no, not at all, not at all. Gosh, what a story. Yeah.
Yeah, it is very sad. But I mean, equally, um, I hope, and that's, I mean, it sounds like a cliche, but you know, I wrote the book, and my dad used to love my writing, and he was always commenting on blogs I'd written. He used to, I mean, a lot of the text messages he sent, he's like, oh, I saw you in the Evening Standard. And, you know, and I wrote, I mean, Lisa and I wrote a whole book about sex, which, and my dad was like, really like, I don't know if he read it, but he would still be like, you know, this is brilliant, I'm so proud of you. And I think that's one positive thing, is that, you know, I know that he would enjoy the fact, because I mean, ultimately, someone said to me, they said, you know, your dad would have wanted you to continue your life, and he would have wanted you to be as happy as you could be. And I think sometimes you have to remember that, you know, there are days when I'm really mourning him, and then I almost hear his voice going, come on, you know, you know, you got to carry on, you got, you know, you got these lovely kids, and you know, you're writing. And I think for our own parents, they wouldn't want to see us miserable every single day.
I wholeheartedly agree with you. And I feel like your dad is obviously a huge source of inspiration. And I have no doubt in my mind that he's around you and as an angel guiding you and your family.
Yeah, I mean, it's strange. There's been a couple of strange sort of things that have happened. I mean, before we started, we were talking about mediums and things, and I've been very open to that. But the only thing I wanted to do is I wanted a bit of time to go past, because I think in the beginning I was so desperate for any form of contact that I think that would almost colour my vision. I think literally, if someone said, "Oh, I can see the letter S," I'd be like, "Right, that's it, he's there," you know. So I want to try it when I've let it calm down a little bit, you know.
Yeah, yeah, I'm excited for you to try that. I feel like that will be a really important part of your grief journey. And I have something, another interview that I did on Friday that I can't wait to share with you. about a lovely man. His father committed suicide, and then his son died. But he's really had quite an extraordinary stories of synchronicity and connection with them on the other side. So
Oh, see, that's great. And the other strange thing that happened is my youngest daughter was born on the same day as my dad. And there's kind of strange things around dates.
There really is.
So, you know, and afterwards I kept saying, you know, her birthday is going to be really sad for me because it's my dad's birthday. But then I was thinking, if you turn it the other way, your dad's birthday would have always been sad once he died. But now you have this new person in your life and you have to celebrate her. So it's life and death just rubbing up against one another. And she wasn't due on that day. So, you know, when you just sort of think, I mean, you know, it feels quite uncanny, you know, sometimes how things work out.
Amazing. It really is. I love all of that. I think it's so incredible. And the final question is, how would you interpret this phrase, conscious grief?
I mean, I think it's a lovely phrase because I think it's almost like in the past, perhaps grief was just something that just happened to you, and, you know, and you were quite passive and you didn't know what was going on, and you were kind of encouraged to I suppose not to dwell on it, to kind of not think about it, to not try and navigate it. It was a tsunami and it hit you and you tried to hide away, and maybe you tried to, and now I think the idea of it being conscious to me means that I'm aware of the process and I'm sharing the process and I'm feeling the actual feelings and I'm not pretending that it's not happening. And for me, that probably what most accurately would do that is that sometimes I'll just consciously choose a piece of music and listen to it in order to feel that grief. And that for me is a conscious decision. I think that's healthy, sort of healthy grieving, I guess.
Yeah. Oh, Anniki, thank you so much. I love that interpretation, and I have so enjoyed speaking to you. I'm sorry that we haven't got another half an hour.
Well, I've really enjoyed it, so thank you. That's been great.
Yeah, well, let's stay in touch, and I can't wait to share more of the interviews. And to everybody that's been watching, thank you so much, and goodbye.